Hello, and welcome back to another gentle journey through the curious corridors of history. Tonight, we're exploring one of humanity's most peculiar claims, the assertion that sleep, that most universal of human experiences, can simply be ... abandoned. As you settle in wherever you are, perhaps adjusting your pillow or pulling your blanket a little closer, consider this. While you prepare to drift into the very thing our subjects tonight claim to have conquered, they walked through endless nights, eyes wide, hearts beating, claiming victory over the very thing you're about to surrender to. Before we begin this quiet exploration together, if you enjoy what we do here, these slow meanders through history's oddest corners, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And I'm always curious to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a quiet bedroom somewhere? Or perhaps listening as dawn breaks? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're joining us for this sleepless journey. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all here together, even in our solitude. Now dim the lights if you can, and let's step into a world where the boundary between waking and sleeping became beautifully, impossibly blurred. Verse 1. The Watchman of Derbyshire. A 17th century man walking the town each night, swearing he hasn't slept in 20 years. In the rolling hills of Derbyshire, where stone walls divide fields that have known sheep and rain for centuries, there lived a man whose neighbors whispered about him with a kind of fascination reserved for miracles and madmen. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and by his own account, he had not slept a single night in 20 years. Picture, if you will, the England of 1687. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and wet wool, and darkness falls like a heavy curtain across villages where candlelight flickers in small windows. Most folk retire when the sun sets, their bodies naturally surrendering to the rhythm that has governed human life since time immemorial. But Thomas Whitmore had, he claimed, stepped outside this ancient dance entirely. Each evening, as the last light faded from the western sky, Thomas would begin his ritual. He would don his heavy wool cloak, the same one he'd worn for a decade, now bearing the particular sheen that comes from countless nights of walking. His boots, sturdy leather things that had been resoled more times than he could count, would carry him out into the night air, where his breath would form small clouds in the cool darkness. The cobblestones of the main street knew his footsteps better than those of any other soul. Hour after hour, he would walk the same circuit, from the village green to the old oak tree, past the church where others prayed for peaceful slumber, around the mill where the wheel sat silent in the darkness, and back again. His route never varied, as if he were following some invisible track worn into the very fabric of the night. The townspeople, those who occasionally glimpsed him through their shutters, spoke of him in hushed, wondering tones. "There goes Thomas," they would whisper to their spouses, "walking again." Some claimed to have seen him pass their windows at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at the deepest hour before dawn. Always walking, always alert, his eyes reflecting what little light the moon offered. But what did Thomas himself experience during these endless nights? By his own account, he felt no fatigue, no drowsiness, no desire to rest. He described his mind as perfectly clear, his thoughts as sharp as they had ever been. He claimed to see things in the darkness that others missed, the way shadows move differently in winter than in summer, how the sound of his own footsteps changed with the humidity of the air, the subtle variations in the church bell's tone, depending on the direction of the wind. The local physician, Dr. Harrington, had examined Thomas multiple times, pressing his ear to the man's chest to listen to his heart, checking his pulse, observing the clarity of his eyes. By all accounts, Thomas appeared to be in perfect health. His skin was neither pale nor flushed, his hands steady, his speech clear and measured. Dr. Harrington documented these observations in his journal, writing in the careful script of his time. The subject presents no signs of the exhaustion one would expect from such prolonged wakefulness. His constitution appears robust, his mental faculties unimpaired. Yet the mystery deepened when neighbors began keeping their own informal watch. Mrs. Catherine Holbrook, whose cottage sat directly across from Thomas's modest dwelling, claimed that she had never once seen a light in his windows after sunset. Not the warm glow of a candle, not the flicker of a fire in the hearth. His house stood dark and seemingly empty while he walked the streets, as if it were merely a shell he visited briefly during the daylight hours. During the day, Thomas worked as a scribe, copying documents for the local magistrate. Those who employed him noted that his handwriting remained remarkably consistent. No tremor in his letters, no signs of the fatigue that might cause one's penmanship to deteriorate. He would arrive each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, his boots still bearing traces of the previous night's dew, his cloak carrying the scent of night air and distant fields. His employer, Magistrate Fitzgerald, once asked him directly about his unusual habits. Thomas replied with the same calm certainty he always displayed. "Sleep, sir, is a luxury I seem to have outgrown. I find the night hours far too interesting to waste in unconsciousness." When pressed to explain what exactly he found so fascinating about the dark hours, Thomas would only smile and say, "There are conversations that can only be heard when the rest of the world is silent." The seasons changed around Thomas's nightly walks. In summer, he would remove his cloak and walk in his shirt sleeves, the warm air carrying the scent of flowers and growing things. In winter, he would wrap himself more tightly, his breath forming larger clouds in the bitter air, but his pace never slowed, his routine never varied. Spring brought the sound of rain on cobblestones, and autumn, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his feet. Some claimed to have joined him on his walks, but these accounts were always vague, dreamlike. A merchant named Peter Wills insisted he had once walked beside Thomas for several hours, engaged in conversation about the nature of time and the peculiar quality of moonlight. But when Peter tried to recall the specific words they had exchanged, the memory slipped away like water through his fingers. He could remember the feeling of the conversation deep, meaningful, almost philosophical, but the actual content remained frustratingly elusive. The children of the village created their own folklore around Thomas. They would dare each other to spy on him from their bedroom windows, though most found that watching his steady, measured pace actually made them drowsier rather than more alert. Some claimed he could appear and disappear at will, though this was likely the result of childhood imagination combined with the natural way. Shadows shift and change in moonlight. As the years passed, Thomas's legend grew. Travelers would sometimes arrive in the village, having heard stories of the man who never sleeps, expecting to find some sort of wild-eyed madman or mystical prophet. Instead, they would encounter a perfectly ordinary middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, who simply happened to claim that sleep had become unnecessary for him. The local vicar, Reverend Blackwood, was particularly intrigued by Thomas's case. He would sometimes engage Thomas in theological discussions, wondering aloud whether this might be some form of divine gift or perhaps a test of faith. Thomas would listen politely to these theories, but never offered any spiritual explanation for his condition. "I simply find myself awake, Reverend," he would say. "Whether by God's will or nature's whim, I cannot say." Dr. Harrington continued his observations, eventually compiling a detailed case study that he shared with colleagues in London. The medical community of the time was divided. Some believed Thomas was simply an elaborate hoaxer, while others found his case genuinely puzzling. The lack of any obvious signs of sleep deprivation made it difficult to dismiss his claims entirely. The nights wore on, year after year, and Thomas continued his solitary walks. The cobblestones knew his footsteps, the shadows anticipated his presence, and the sleeping village grew accustomed to the sound of his boots on stone, a steady, rhythmic reminder that while they dreamed, someone else remained awake, keeping watch over the darkness. And perhaps, in the end, that was what Thomas truly offered his community. Not proof of human transcendence over basic biological needs, but simply the comfort of knowing that someone was awake, someone was watching. Someone was walking the quiet streets while the rest of the world surrendered to sleep. Verse 2. The man who never slept. The curious case of Al Herpin, the man who never slept, in early 20th century New Jersey. As we drift forward through time, leaving the cobblestones of Derbyshire behind, we find ourselves in a very different world, the bustling industrial landscape of early 20th century New Jersey. Here, among the factory smokestacks and newly electrified streets, lived a man whose claim to sleeplessness would capture the attention of doctors, journalists, and curious visitors from around the world. His name was Al Herpin, and his story unfolds like a gentle puzzle, each piece more intriguing than the last. Picture Trenton, New Jersey, in the year 1904. The air carries the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tongue of industry, while electric streetlights cast their steady glow where once only gas lamps flickered. Progress hums through the streets in the form of trolley cars and the distant whistle of steam engines. It is in this modern world that we meet Alfred Herpin, a man in his late 50s who worked as a hostler at the local livery stable. Al Herpin was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man in most respects. He stood of average height with the calloused hands of someone who had spent decades working with horses and leather. His face bore the weathered look of outdoor labor, and his manner was quiet, almost shy. But Al possessed one characteristic that would set him apart from every other human being who had ever lived. He claimed, quite simply, that he had never slept. Not that he slept poorly, or that he was an insomniac who caught occasional moments of rest. Al Herpin maintained, with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact, that he had never once in his entire life experienced sleep. No dreams, no periods of unconsciousness, no moments of rest that others might recognize as slumber. For nearly 60 years, he claimed, he had remained continuously awake. Dr. George Howe, a physician practicing in Trenton, first encountered Al Herpin in 1904 when the man visited his office complaining of a minor ailment. During the consultation, Al mentioned almost casually that he never slept, the way another person might mention they never ate fish or never traveled by train. Dr. Howe, initially skeptical, began what would become a decade-long study of this most unusual patient. The examination room where Dr. Howe first studied Al was typical of the era white walls. A simple wooden examination table, medical instruments that gleamed with the cold precision of early modern medicine. But the conversations that took place in that room were anything but typical. Al would sit calmly, his hands folded in his lap, answering questions about his condition with the patient demeanor of someone who had explained the inexplicable many times before. "I simply don't sleep, doctor," Al would say, his voice carrying the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "I lie down at night, certainly, but I remain awake. I watch the shadows change position on the wall. I listen to the sounds of the house settling. I think about the day's work. But sleep? No, that has never come to me." Dr. Howe's initial skepticism gave way to genuine curiosity as he observed Al over the following months. He arranged for Al to stay overnight at the hospital on several occasions, with nurses instructed to check on him hourly throughout the night. The reports were always the same. Al would lie quietly in his bed, his eyes open, following the movement of the nurses with polite interest. His breathing remained steady, but never took on the deeper, slower rhythm of sleep. His body showed none of the subtle movements, the shifting, the turning, the unconscious adjustments that characterize even the lightest sleeper. The medical community of the time was fascinated by Al's case. Dr. Howe published papers about his observations, describing how Al's pulse remained steady throughout the night, how his blood pressure showed none of the fluctuations typical of sleep cycles, how his eyes never exhibited the rapid movements that had recently been identified as characteristic of dreaming sleep. Yet despite this apparent lack of rest, Al showed no signs of the deterioration that medical science insisted should accompany chronic sleep deprivation. Al's daily routine was as regular as clockwork. He would rise each morning at 5 o'clock, though rise might not be the proper word for someone who had never been asleep. He would wash, dress in his work clothes, and walk the 6 blocks to the livery stable where he had worked for over 20 years. His employer, Mr. Samuel Crenshaw, noted that Al was the most reliable worker he had ever employed. Never late, never absent, never showing signs of fatigue or inattention. The horses seemed to sense something different about Al. They would calm in his presence in a way that others found remarkable. Whether this was due to his perpetual alertness, his gentle manner, or some other quality, no one could say. But visitors to the stable would often comment on how peaceful the animals appeared when Al was working among them. During his lunch break, Al would sit on a wooden crate outside the stable, eating the simple meal he brought from home, usually bread, cheese, and an apple. He would eat slowly, methodically, his eyes taking in the street scene before him. People would sometimes approach him, having heard rumors of the man who never slept. Al would answer their questions politely, but without enthusiasm. He seemed to view his condition as neither a blessing nor a curse, but simply as the way things were. "Don't you ever feel tired?" was perhaps the most common question he received. Al would consider this carefully before answering. "I feel the fatigue of physical labor, certainly," he would say. "At the end of a long day, my muscles ache, my back is sore. But that drowsiness, that pull toward unconsciousness that others describe, no, I have never experienced that." Evenings in the Herpin household followed a pattern that had been established over decades. All lived alone in a modest boarding house room, furnished with only the essentials: a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a small table. When darkness fell, he would light his oil lamp and sit in the chair, sometimes reading the newspaper, sometimes simply watching the play of shadows on the wall. The other boarders in the house grew accustomed to seeing the thin line of light beneath Al's door at all hours of the night. Mrs. Kowalski, the landlady, initially worried that Al might be ill or troubled by some midnight malady. But over time, she came to accept his unusual habits. "Mr. Herpin pays his rent on time and causes no trouble," she would tell curious visitors. "If he chooses to keep his lamp burning all night, that is his business." Dr. Howe's documentation of Al's case became increasingly detailed as the years passed. He noted that Al's memory was exceptionally sharp, particularly for events that occurred during the nighttime hours. While others might have only hazy recollections of late-night conversations or activities, Al could recall them with perfect clarity. He remembered the exact words of conversations that had taken place months earlier, the precise times certain events had occurred, the specific details of scenes that others had forgotten. The question of Al's mental state became a subject of considerable interest. Dr. Howe administered various tests designed to assess cognitive function, reaction time, and psychological well-being. In every case, Al's results fell within the normal range. His thinking was clear, his judgment sound, his emotional responses appropriate. He showed no signs of the hallucinations, paranoia, or other mental disturbances that medical textbooks suggested should accompany severe sleep deprivation. As word of Al's case spread, visitors began arriving in Trenton specifically to meet him. Scientists, doctors, and journalists would make the journey to observe this medical curiosity firsthand. Al received them all with the same quiet courtesy, answering their questions patiently, submitting to their tests and observations without complaint. He seemed to understand that his condition was of scientific interest, and he cooperated fully with those who sought to study him. One particularly memorable visitor was Dr. Rachel Morrison, one of the first female physicians to practice in New Jersey. She spent 3 days observing Al, both at his work and in his boarding house room. Her notes, preserved in the medical archives of the time, describe a man who appeared to exist in a state of perpetual, calm alertness. "He is neither agitated nor drowsy," she wrote. "Rather, he seems to inhabit a space between waking and sleeping, that the rest of us never access. The seasons changed around Al's unchanging routine. Summer brought longer days and shorter nights, but Al's schedule remained constant. Winter arrived with earlier darkness and later dawns, but still Al sat in his chair, his lamp burning, his eyes open to the night. Spring and autumn came and went, marked by the changing sounds outside his window, the calls of different birds, the rustle of leaves, the varying rhythms of rain on the roof. Local newspapers began featuring stories about Al, describing him as Trenton's most remarkable resident and the man who never sleeps. These articles drew even more visitors, some genuine in their scientific curiosity, others merely seeking entertainment. All treated all with the same patient dignity, neither courting attention nor shunning it. Dr. Howe continued his observations until his retirement in 1915, by which time he had documented over a decade of Al's sleepless existence. His final report on the case concluded that Al Herpin represented a genuine medical anomaly that challenges our understanding of human sleep requirements. The report acknowledged that medical science had no explanation for Al's condition, but the evidence of his prolonged wakefulness was too substantial to dismiss. And so Al Herpin continued his quiet existence in Trenton, working at the livery stable by day, sitting in his chair by night, his oil lamp casting its steady glow against the darkness. Whether his condition was the result of some unique genetic variation, a psychological adaptation, or something else entirely, remained a mystery that would outlive both Al and the doctors who studied him. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Al Herpin was not that he claimed to never sleep, but that he managed to live such a peaceful, productive life while carrying this extraordinary burden or gift of perpetual consciousness. He became a gentle reminder that human experience contains mysteries that cannot always be explained, puzzles that resist solution, and individuals who somehow manage to exist outside the boundaries of what we consider normal. Verse 3. The wakeful meditation. Ancient Chinese monks who trained themselves to meditate through sleep and maybe succeeded. From the industrial streets of New Jersey, our journey now carries us across oceans and centuries to the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient China, where Buddhist monasteries clung to cliffsides like prayers carved in stone. Here, in the rarefied air of the Himalayas and the sacred peaks of the Middle Kingdom, monks pursued a different kind of sleeplessness, one that was not claimed as a natural condition, but cultivated through decades of disciplined practice. Picture, if you will, the monastery of Zhuangkong-Si, built impossibly into the face of a sheer cliff in what is now Shaanxi province. The year is 847 CE, during the Tang Dynasty, when Buddhism flourished in China like incense spreading through temple halls. The morning mist clings to the mountainside, and the sound of temple bells echoes across valleys so deep that their bottoms remain perpetually shrouded in cloud. In this ethereal setting lived a community of monks who had dedicated their lives to what they called the practice of conscious dreaming, a meditation technique so advanced that it allegedly allowed practitioners to remain aware and alert even while their bodies appeared to sleep. These were not men who claimed to have abandoned sleep entirely, but rather those who sought to transform sleep itself into another form of meditation. The practice was known as Mengzhong Jingzuo, literally meaning meditation within dreams. According to the ancient texts preserved in the monastery's library, this technique required years of preparation, beginning with basic mindfulness exercises and progressing through increasingly subtle levels of awareness. The monks would spend their days in traditional meditation, learning to observe their thoughts without attachment, to maintain awareness of their breathing, to remain present in each moment. Master Chun Wu-wei, whose name appears in the monastery records as the foremost teacher of this practice, would begin instruction of new students with a simple exercise. He would have them sit in meditation posture as the sun set, instructing them to maintain awareness of their breathing while allowing their bodies to relax completely. The goal, he would tell them in his gentle, measured voice, is not to prevent sleep, but to remain awake within it, The meditation hall where these practices took place was a marvel of ancient architecture. Built entirely of wood, without the use of a single nail, it seemed to float against the cliff face like a bridge between earth and heaven. The floor was covered with woven mats made from mountain grass, and the walls were adorned with paintings of celestial beings who appeared to be neither fully awake nor asleep, but existing in some transcendent state between the two. Students would begin their training by learning to recognize the exact moment when consciousness began to fade toward sleep. They would lie on their simple straw mats, focusing intently on the sensation of drowsiness as it crept through their bodies. The training required them to identify the subtle shift in awareness that preceded sleep, to catch that moment when the mind began to release its grip on waking consciousness. Brother Li Mingshan, whose journal survived in the monastery archives, wrote of his early experiences with the practice. At first, I would lose awareness the moment sleep approached, awakening hours later with no memory of the transition. But gradually, through Master Chun's guidance, I learned to maintain a thin thread of consciousness even as my body surrendered to rest. It was like watching a candle flame from a great distance, barely visible, but never completely extinguished. The monastery's daily schedule was designed to support this unusual practice. The monks would rise at 4 in the morning for traditional meditation, followed by simple meals of rice, vegetables, and tea. They would spend the day in various forms of spiritual practice, copying sacred texts, tending the monastery gardens, engaging in philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness and reality. But it was during the evening hours that the most intensive training took place. As darkness settled over the mountains, the monks would gather in the meditation hall for what they called the evening preparation. They would sit in perfect stillness, their breathing synchronized, their minds focused on the approaching night. The only sounds were the distant whisper of wind through the mountain passes and the soft rustle of robes as the monks adjusted their postures. Master Chun would guide them through a series of increasingly subtle meditations. First, they would focus on the sensation of their breath, then on the spaces between breaths, then on the awareness that observed the breathing itself. Gradually, they would learn to identify the different layers of consciousness, recognizing that what they normally thought of as awareness was actually composed of many different levels of perception. The advanced practitioners claimed to experience what they called the divided consciousness, a state where part of their awareness remained alert and observant, while another part of their mind entered the dream state. They described it as being simultaneously asleep and awake, dreaming and lucid, resting and vigilant. Brother Wei Zhuangming, who practiced the technique for over 30 years, wrote in his spiritual autobiography, "In the deep hours of the night, I would find myself in 2 places at once. My body would rest upon the mat, breathing slowly and deeply, appearing to all observers to be in profound sleep. But my consciousness would remain clear and bright, watching the dreams that arose like clouds in an empty sky, neither becoming lost in them nor pushing them away." The monastery kept detailed records of these practices, documenting the experiences of monks who claimed to have achieved various levels of conscious dreaming. Some reported being able to control their dreams, directing the narrative and imagery at will. Others described a state of pure awareness that transcended both waking and sleeping, a consciousness that remained constant whether their bodies were active or at rest. One particularly intriguing account comes from Master Hongzhi, who claimed to have reached a state where the distinction between sleeping and waking had become meaningless. According to his writings, he would spend the entire night in meditation, his body appearing to sleep while his mind remained in a state of crystalline clarity. He described being able to observe the monastery's activities throughout the night, the movements of other monks, the sounds of nocturnal animals, the changing patterns of stars through the windows, while appearing to outside observers to be deeply asleep. The scientific understanding of these practices remained limited, but the monks developed their own sophisticated theories about consciousness and sleep. They believed that what most people experienced as sleep was actually a state of confused consciousness, where awareness became entangled with mental formations and dream imagery. Their practice aimed to maintain clarity of mind, regardless of the body's state, to remain like a clear mirror that reflects whatever appears before it without becoming stained by the images. Visitors to the monastery would sometimes witness these practices, though they were rarely allowed to observe the most advanced practitioners. Foreign travelers, including some early Western explorers, left accounts of seeing monks who appeared to be sleeping, but whose eyes remained slightly open, whose breathing remained controlled and intentional, rather than the automatic rhythm of natural sleep. The monastery's library contained texts that described the progressive stages of this practice. The first stage involved learning to maintain awareness during the transition into sleep. The second stage required practitioners to remain conscious during light sleep while allowing their bodies to rest. The third stage involved maintaining awareness during deep sleep, when the body entered its most restorative phase. The final stage, achieved by only a few masters, was described as a state of continuous meditation that transcended the normal cycles of waking and sleeping entirely. The training was not without its challenges. Many monks reported experiencing periods of confusion when the boundaries between dreaming and waking became blurred during their daily activities. Some would find themselves uncertain whether conversations they remembered had actually taken place or had been part of a dream. The practice required careful guidance from experienced teachers who could help students navigate these liminal states without losing their psychological equilibrium. The monastery also maintained strict rules about discussing these practices with outsiders. The monks believed that the techniques could be dangerous if practiced without proper preparation and guidance. They had observed that some practitioners who attempted to force the state of conscious dreaming without adequate training would develop sleep disorders or psychological disturbances. As the centuries passed, the practice of conscious dreaming became increasingly rare, even within the monastery walls. The political upheavals that swept through China, the suppression of Buddhist practices during certain dynastic periods, and the simple difficulty of maintaining such a demanding spiritual discipline all contributed to the gradual decline of the tradition. Yet the records remain, preserved in the monastery's archives like pressed flowers between the pages of ancient books. They speak of human consciousness as something far more flexible and mysterious than most of us imagine, suggesting that the boundaries between sleeping and waking, between dreaming and awareness, may be more permeable than we assume. The monks of Zhuangkongzi sought not to conquer sleep, but to transform it into another form of spiritual practice. They viewed consciousness not as something that disappeared during sleep, but as something that could be trained to remain present and aware, regardless of the body's state. Whether they truly succeeded in their aims remains a mystery, but their efforts remind us that the relationship between consciousness and rest is far more complex than it might first appear. In the end, these ancient practitioners offer us a different perspective on the nature of sleep and awareness. They suggest that perhaps the question is not whether it is possible to live without sleep, but whether it is possible to sleep without losing consciousness, to rest the body while keeping the mind alert, to dream while remaining awake, to find a state of being that transcends the ordinary boundaries of human experience. Verse 4. The Skeptical Witness. A local skeptic keeping a sleep diary on his neighbor, who's definitely just sneaking naps. From the mystical heights of ancient monasteries, we return now to a much more familiar world, the world of everyday skepticism, of neighborly suspicion, and of one man's determined effort to prove that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Our story takes us to the suburban streets of Manchester, England, in the year 1923, where a retired postal clerk named Harold Pemberton had become absolutely convinced that his neighbor's claims of sleeplessness were nothing more than elaborate theatrical nonsense. The street where Harold lived was typical of its time, and placed narrow brick houses standing shoulder to shoulder, each with its small front garden and lace curtains, that twitched whenever something interesting occurred outside. Harold's house sat directly across from number 47, where lived one Mr. Reginald Ashworth, a former railway conductor who had recently begun claiming that he had not slept for over 2 years. Harold Pemberton was a man of methodical habits and deeply practical nature. He had spent 37 years sorting mail for the Royal Post, developing an eye for detail and a profound distrust of anything that seemed too remarkable to be true. When Mr. Ashworth began telling anyone who would listen about his extraordinary sleeplessness, Harold's skeptical instincts were immediately aroused. "Mark my words, Margaret," Harold would say to his wife over their morning tea. "That man across the street is having us all on. No one can go without sleep for 2 years and still manage to trim his hedges with such precision. There's something fishy about the whole business." Margaret Pemberton, a woman of gentler disposition who had learned to navigate her husband's suspicious nature over 23 years of marriage, would nod politely while buttering her toast. "Perhaps he's simply an unusual case, Harold. Dr. Matthews did examine him after all." But Harold was not so easily convinced. "Dr. Matthews is a good man, but he's too trusting by half. What we need here is proper observation, Margaret, scientific method. I intend to get to the bottom of this." And so began Harold's great investigation, a meticulous, obsessive campaign to document every moment of his neighbor's existence. He purchased a thick ledger bound in black leather, the kind he had used for official postal business, and began what he called his sleep surveillance log. The first entry, dated March 15th, 1923, read simply, "Project commenced. Subject: R. Ashworth, age 52, claims to have not slept since January 1921. Hypothesis: subject is deceiving community for unknown reasons." Harold's method was simple but thorough. He would position himself at his bedroom window, which offered a clear view of Mr. Ashworth's front rooms, armed with a pair of opera glasses that had belonged to his late mother. Every evening he would begin his vigil, carefully noting the times when lights appeared in various windows, when shadows moved behind curtains, when any sign of activity could be detected in the house across the street. The early entries in Harold's log were filled with triumphant observations. March 18th, 11:47 p.m., light extinguished in front parlor, subject likely preparing for secret sleep. March 19th, 12:23 a.a., no movement detected in any window. Subject almost certainly asleep, despite claims to contrary. But as the days turned into weeks, Harold's confident assertions began to give way to puzzlement. Night after night, he would observe a faint glow emanating from Mr. Ashworth's kitchen window. Not the bright illumination of electric lights, but the softer, warmer light of a single candle or oil lamp. The shadow of a figure would move occasionally across the window, always at the same measured pace, always following what appeared to be the same routine. Harold's wife grew concerned about her husband's nocturnal activities. "Harold, you're going to make yourself ill staying up all night watching the neighbors. And what if Mr. Ashworth notices you spying on him? What will people think?" "Science requires sacrifice, Margaret," Harold would reply, adjusting his opera glasses. "If I'm going to prove this man is a fraud, I need to catch him in the act. One night, I'll see him nodding off in his chair, or I'll spot him sneaking upstairs for a proper sleep. Mark my words." As spring progressed into summer, Harold's log grew increasingly detailed. He began noting not just the presence or absence of light in Mr. Ashworth's windows, but also the quality of that light, the patterns of shadow movement, the precise timing of what appeared to be Mr. Ashworth's nightly routine. The entries became almost poetic in their precision. June 3rd, 10:15 p.m. Candlelit in kitchen. Subject's shadow visible, moving from sink to table. 10:47 p.m. Shadow moves to window, remains stationary for 23 minutes. 11:10 p.m. Shadow begins regular pacing pattern, east to west, 47 steps each direction. Midnight. pattern continues unchanged. Harold's obsession with documenting Mr. Ashworth's activities began to affect his own sleep patterns. He would doze fitfully in his chair by the window, starting awake every hour or so to check on his neighbor's house. His wife would find him in the morning, slumped over his ledger, his opera glasses hanging around his neck, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "You're becoming the very thing you're trying to disprove," Margaret observed one morning, bringing him a cup of tea. Perhaps Mr. Ashworth isn't the only one who's forgotten how to sleep properly. But Harold dismissed such concerns. He was convinced that his vigilance would eventually be rewarded with definitive proof of Mr. Ashworth's deception. He began expanding his surveillance efforts, recruiting Mrs. Weatherby from next door to keep watch during the hours when he absolutely had to rest. Mrs. Weatherby, a widow in her 70s with little else to occupy her time, initially found the project amusing. "It's like a detective story, isn't it, Mr. Pemberton? Very exciting." But her reports only added to Harold's frustration. She, too, observed the steady light in Mr. Ashworth's kitchen, the regular pacing shadows, the complete absence of any behavior that might suggest sleep. By autumn, Harold's log had grown to over 200 pages of detailed observations. He had documented Mr. Ashworth's nighttime routine with scientific precision, noting that the man appeared to spend his evenings engaged in what looked like reading or writing at his kitchen table, taking regular breaks to pace back and forth across the room, occasionally moving to the window to look out at the street. October 12th, 2:30 a.m. now. Subject appears to be writing in some kind of journal or notebook. Posture remains erect, no signs of drowsiness. 3:15 a.m. Subject rises, stretches, resumes pacing. Movement appears deliberate, not restless. 4 a.m. Subject returns to table, continues writing. Harold's wife suggested that perhaps he should speak directly to Mr. Ashworth about his concerns. "You've been watching him for months, Harold. Surely you could simply ask him what he does during those long nights." Perhaps he'd be happy to explain. The idea had never occurred to Harold. His investigative approach had been entirely observational, like a naturalist studying some exotic species. The thought of actually communicating with his subject seemed almost like cheating, a violation of scientific protocol. But as winter approached, Harold's curiosity finally overcame his methodical caution. One evening in November, he crossed the street and knocked on Mr. Ashworth's door. The man who answered was neat, alert, and showed no signs of the fatigue that Harold had expected to find. "Mr. Pemberton, isn't it? How nice to see you. Please come in." Harold found himself in a tidy kitchen, warmed by a coal fire and lit by several oil lamps. The table was covered with paper's letters, it appeared, written in a careful, even hand. Mr. Ashworth noticed Harold's gaze and smiled. "I've become quite the correspondent since I stopped sleeping," he explained. "I write to my sister in Australia, to old colleagues from the railway, to anyone who might be interested in hearing from an old man with time on his hands. The nights are quite long when you're awake for all of them." Harold studied his neighbor carefully, looking for signs of deception. Mr. Ashworth's eyes were clear, his speech coherent, his movements steady. He showed none of the symptoms Harold had expected. No trembling hands, no bloodshot eyes, no signs of the mental confusion that surely should accompany months of sleeplessness. "I suppose you think I'm mad," Mr. Ashworth said gently. "Most people do, at first, but I can't help the way I am. Sleep simply stopped coming to me. I've learned to make the best of it." Harold spent 2 hours in Mr. Ashworth's kitchen that evening, drinking tea and listening to stories about the man's former life as a railway conductor. When he finally returned home, he found his wife waiting up for him. "Well?" Margaret asked. "Did you solve your mystery?" Harold sat heavily in his chair, his ledger unopened for the first time in months. "I'm not sure there was a mystery to solve," he admitted. "The man seems perfectly genuine. Unusual, certainly, but not fraudulent. The final entry in Harold's sleep surveillance log, dated November 23, 1923, was shorter than most. Investigation concluded, subject appears to be truthful about his condition. No evidence of deception detected. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only observed. Harold's obsessive documentation had revealed something unexpected, not proof of fraud, but proof of the observer's own limitations. His months of surveillance had taught him that extraordinary claims, while they might indeed require extraordinary evidence, sometimes resist the kind of simple explanations that skepticism demands. In the years that followed, Harold would occasionally glance across the street at the soft glow in Mr. Ashworth's kitchen window, but he no longer felt the need to document or explain what he saw there. He had learned that some neighbors, like some mysteries, are best accepted rather than solved. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of Harold's great investigation, that the world contains genuine oddities that cannot be explained away by suspicion or surveillance. That sometimes the most rational response to the impossible is simply to acknowledge it and move on. Mr. Ashworth continued his nightly routine of letter writing and gentle pacing, his kitchen light burning steady as a lighthouse beacon. Harold returned to sleeping through the night, his ledger closed, his opera glasses returned to their drawer. Both men had found their own form of peace with the mystery of sleeplessness, one by living it, the other by finally choosing to stop trying to solve it. Conclusion: the gentle return to sleep. And so our journey through the twilight realm of claimed sleeplessness comes to its quiet close. We have walked the cobblestone streets of Derbyshire with Thomas Whitmore, whose nightly vigils became a comfort to his sleeping neighbors. We have sat in the examination rooms of early 20th century New Jersey, watching doctors puzzle over Al Herpen's impossible wakefulness. We have climbed to the mist-shrouded monasteries of ancient China, where monks sought to transform sleep itself into a form of meditation. And we have peered through Harold Pemberton's opera glasses, watching skepticism gradually give way to acceptance of life's inexplicable mysteries. Each of these stories, whether rooted in historical fact, spiritual practice, or neighborly curiosity, speaks to something fundamental about the human relationship with sleep. They remind us that rest, this most basic of biological needs, remains one of our greatest mysteries. Every night, we surrender consciousness, trusting our bodies to carry us through hours of vulnerability and dreams, only to wake refreshed and renewed. The people we have met tonight, the claimed sleepless ones, stand as curious exceptions to this universal experience. Whether their conditions were genuine medical anomalies, elaborate performances, or something else entirely, they each found ways to exist in the spaces between waking and sleeping, between the conscious and unconscious worlds. Thomas Whitmore found purpose in his endless nights, becoming a gentle guardian of his village's darkness. Al Herpen lived with quiet dignity, turning his unusual condition into a subject of scientific inquiry that challenged medical understanding. The monastery monks transformed their practice into a spiritual discipline, seeking consciousness that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. And Harold Pemberton discovered that some mysteries are more valuable when accepted rather than solved. Perhaps what these stories really tell us is not that sleep can be conquered or abandoned, but that it can be appreciated. Tonight, as you prepare to enter that mysterious realm that our subjects claim to have left behind, consider the gift you are about to receive. Your eyes will grow heavy, your breathing will deepen, and consciousness will gently fade like the last light of evening. You will dream dreams that may be profound or silly, meaningful or random, but that will be entirely your own. Your body will repair itself. Your mind will process the day's experiences, and you will wake tomorrow renewed in ways that science still struggles to fully understand. The sleepless ones we have met tonight, in their various ways, remind us that this nightly journey into unconsciousness is not something to be taken for granted. It is a privilege, a necessity, and a mystery all at once. Whether they truly conquered sleep or simply learned to live with its absence, They each found their own accommodation with the darkness. And now, as our gentle exploration comes to its end, you can surrender to what they claim to have abandoned. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow your thoughts to drift like clouds across a quiet sky. Feel the weight of your body settling into rest, your mind releasing its grip on the day's concerns. Unlike Thomas Whitmore, you need not walk the midnight streets. Unlike Al Herpin, you need not sit wakeful in your chair. Unlike the monastery monks, you need not maintain consciousness through the night. Unlike Harold Pemberton, you need not stay vigilant to solve life's mysteries. You can simply sleep. Let the soft darkness welcome you, as it has welcomed countless generations before you. Rest in the knowledge that while you dream, the world continues its quiet turning, and that you will wake tomorrow to new possibilities, new stories, new gentle mysteries to explore. Sleep well, knowing that in choosing rest, you are participating in one of humanity's most ancient and essential rituals. And perhaps, in your dreams, you might even encounter some of the sleepless ones we have met tonight, walking their eternal vigils in the landscapes of imagination. The night is yours. The sleep is yours. The dreams are yours. Rest now.